The next thing we're going to talk about when we talk about describing distributions of quantitative variables is the outliers. So outliers are extreme values that don't appear to belong with the rest of the data. So they kind of fall outside of the overall pattern. This is a scatter plot here on the right. So this one is really easy to see. This one lonely dot out here is not part of the rest of the pattern. So we would call that dot there an outlier. Outliers need additional considerations. So things you want to think about when you see an outlier in your data are, where did that unusual value come from? Is it a mistake? So maybe somebody handwrote the data and somebody else typed it and they misread the handwriting, or they transposed two numbers when they were typing it in. So if it's a mistake and you can determine exactly what the mistake is, you can go in and fix that. Is it something important? Is it just random variation? So you always want to investigate those outliers to find out kind of what's going on with those. And typically with outliers, if it's not a mistake that's correctable, then a lot of times what we do is we report the statistics and data for the main pattern, and then we also report those same values, but with the outlier included, so people can kind of see the impact that outlier has on the data. Most important thing is, do not just toss out an outlier without comment. So anytime that shows up in your data, that's definitely something you would want to talk about in your write-up. Okay, let's look at outliers on a histogram. Now, unfortunately, these are a little bit harder to tell than they are with the scatter plot. So we kind of have the main pattern of the histogram here on the left, and then we have these ones that kind of trail off to the right. So if I was describing this in terms of skew, this would be right skewed. It trails off to the right side. And then in terms of which ones of these are outliers. So definitely these two furthest out are going to be outliers. This one that's kind of between the main pattern and the other outliers, that one's a little bit on the fence. I don't know that I would call that one an outlier without doing some calculations. It's pretty close. It could go either way. And in chapter 2, and then again in chapter 3, we'll look at some ways of actually quantifying or calculating whether it's an outlier. And there's some really just simple calculations that just use basic math, addition, subtraction, multiplication to figure that out. So we'll be looking at how to tell exactly, but for now you just do your best to eyeball it. And in terms of that histogram, you're looking for ones that are just kind of way out in the tails. That's typically where you find your outliers in a histogram, is either way on the left side or way on the right side. Okay, let's look at one more part of describing the distribution of quantitative variables, and that is the spread. So the spread is how variable your data is, how consistent or inconsistent it is. So is it all squished together and grouped around one value, or is it spread out really far apart? Okay, there's a number of different ways of calculating the spread, and we're going to look at 3 of those in this class. So we'll look at the range, the standard deviation, and the IQR. But in chapter 1, we're going to start with the range. So the range is just the difference between the max value and the min value. So in other words, you find the biggest value of your data set and the smallest value in your data set, and then you subtract them. Okay, so we have an example here of California earthquakes and the magnitude of those earthquakes, and then how many earthquakes were in that magnitude range. So if I was calculating the range for this histogram, it looks like that max is up here maybe around, I don't know, 5.2 or something like that. And it looks like the lower end of the range is maybe 0.6. So to find that, the range, I would take the 5.2 and subtract 0.6. So I think that leaves me with about 4.6. So just whatever those two values are subtracted is going to be your range. All right, come back in the next video. We'll take a look at the last item for describing the distribution of quantitative variables.